Hey there, this is Dave from The Greg and Dave Show. Thank you for listening to the following broadcast here on Public House Media.
What's up, everybody? This is Christian Heimel, host of Press Row here on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media. Once you're done with this episode, I hope you'll come check out my show, Press Row, where we talk about the biggest issues in sports with the analysts, experts, and reporters who cover them. No nonsense, hard-hitting interviews on the sports topics you're talking about. A new show comes out every single Thursday. And don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you never miss an episode of Press Row. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppy. Find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. This podcast is brought to you by Public House Media. You can check them out at thephmedia.com, or you can just type in Public House Media on Facebook. Either will do. If you want to grab my book and you don't have it already, it is available on Amazon, or it's available on Amazon. If you know me and you live near me, or even if you don't live near me, I really don't care. If you know me and you want a signed copy, you can get one from me. If you don't live near me, you'll have to pay for the shipping costs, but the initial price of the book will be a little lower than what's up on Amazon. That's just how it is. We are going to jump in our word of the week since we missed it 2 weeks ago. I don't know, did we have one last week? I can't really remember. Our word of the week is catastrophe, and this is actually related to our accidental essence, if I can actually talk. So in Greek, actually, today, I'm going to go backwards in time rather than going forwards in time. So today, catastrophe means a sudden disaster. I think everybody knows that, or they know at least it's kind of like that. That was the first time that catastrophe meant that was in 1748. Meant sudden disaster. In the 1530s, catastrophe meant a reversal of the unexpected. It was usually seen as a fatal turning point in a play. So there's the catastrophe in a play, and it's something that's fatal, and it's a turning point. I don't know. So Kurt Vonnegut, if you know anything about Kurt Vonnegut, he was a professor of writing, a professor of English, something like that. I'm not checking my own facts here. I'm not looking that stuff up. We don't do that here. We just make stuff up. Come on, people. But he actually has this thing. So there's specific shapes of plots. In the typical shape, looks like a mountain. So you go up, and then there's the crisis point, and then you go down, and there's the falling action, right? But he actually had this thing called Man in a Hole, where the person starts out and everything really sucks, and then they kind of climb up. But there's also one where you go up and then drop down, and that would be a catastrophe in a play. Now, the original, catastrophe is a Greek word, and if you actually know anything about languages, because I'm not going to explain it to you here because this is just a point in the podcast that talks about languages, you can tell this is a Greek word by how it is. I'm sorry. You can tell it's a Greek word by the PHs in it and the E and stuff. Well, at least I can when I see it. So that a catastrophe, these words are the words that I think it's kata and strophe are the two words that make it up, and it means a turning point or a sudden end, or to overturn, or to turn down, or to trample on. So that's what it originally meant. I think that's really interesting. It certainly doesn't mean that today. It is I don't know if it's a fallacy, but I believe it's a fallacy, that if you look back to what something meant, so if you look back and you're like, well, this word used to mean this, therefore it still means that, it doesn't still mean that. Nobody uses it that way. Words change, and the meaning that it means today should be what it's used, what you believe it to be. So if you're like, well, somebody said this, or this is in a text, therefore they meant this. If it's poetic, sure, it could mean that. But in most cases, they probably mean the meaning that is in the dictionary at their time period. So if you want to know the meaning of a word, go back and look at the dictionary or how that word was used in that context, in that time period, and you can understand it. Our accidental essence is we are talking, and by we, I mean me, because this is weird. Isn't it a weird English thing where you are, and teachers do this a lot, and I think it's to be inclusive of people, but, and I'm kind of going off and veering off a little bit here, but I think it's a little weird that in English we have this odd idiosyncrasy where I'm the one talking, and I say we are talking about this, or today we are talking about whatever, when I'm really the one talking about this. There's even, and I use it even as a podcast, so I can understand it in a classroom to a certain degree, because if there's discussion in the classroom, it makes sense to say we are talking about this, because then everybody in the classroom's talking about it. Or if you're in a meeting, we're saying we're talking about this. But on a podcast, it doesn't make any sense. But at the same time, in English, it comes out that way, right? And I think I don't think it's necessarily appropriate, but I don't think it's wrong to say that even on a podcast in terms of what you mean in English. But today we're talking about the world falling apart. we're talking about everything falling down. And we're talking about writing. And by we, I mean me, because that's how it is. I'm going to be talking about writing when everything sucks. This is something that I am familiar with. So I'm going to actually just first explain what I mean. There is a very big difference between sitting down at a computer and being like, I have no idea what to write about. And sitting down at a computer and being like, wow, everything is awful. And I hate it. And I don't know what to write. And it's not that I don't know what to write about. It's just that I can't write because everything is terrible and I hate it. If you've never had that point in your life where you're like, wow, everything is terrible and I hate it, I feel like you have a pretty easy life, or you're going to have some hard times in the future. Or you're just a really, really resilient person. Well, no. You're not a really resilient person, because to be a really, really resilient person, you would have to have times. It's a little hard to say. You would have had to have times where you actually had difficult times. And I can't talk. So I'm gonna explain what goes on in me. I've had some times where it was difficult, and I would say that I still do to a certain degree, where I don't particularly enjoy life. Actually, sometimes when I make podcast episodes, be completely honest, I think about what's going on in my own life, and I kind of make a response. So you probably can figure out what's going on in my life based on what I'm talking about in the podcast episode, but not always, because sometimes I'm in a really good mood and my mind's going 1,000 miles a minute, and I just say whatever. So this happens to me, I don't know if I can say fairly often, but it has to be enough to actually address it. There are some of you that sit down in front of a computer screen, or you sit down to write with a piece of paper, and you say, wow, I just can't think of what to write. It's not that life is particularly bad. I've just got writer's block. And what I say to you is, you should just start writing, and you should start writing whatever. It doesn't really matter. You can start writing the dog eats the bone, or chews on my parents' dog. I don't have a dog. My parents' dog eats bones, but the dog could chew on the bone as well. It does. It seriously eats bones. So you could write the dog chews on the bone 50,000 times, or you could just write whatever the heck is coming to your head, even if it is, I hate writing, it's awful, I don't know how to write, and yada, yada, yada. The point, if you are just sitting down and saying, well, I don't know what to write, you just write, right? You don't really think about it, you just do it. And you can get stuff out, honestly. And then you can develop the habit, you can start writing more and more and more. A big thing that I've learned is you should just set a word count limit, word count amount. Rhymes. You should remember a word count amount. And let's just say you're like, well, I'm going to write 400 words a day, 300, 100. 100 is very, very short. I don't even think that's a page. Just write 100 words a day. Write that sucker. Don't even write the best you can. Just get it out. And if you want to write more, just add more, right? Just have a word count you do, and you get into the habit of doing it, and you do it. Now, there are some other people, and this is who I'm talking about today, where you are in a particularly bad situation. It could be just something happening in your life. It could be something happening in your life, such as somebody died, or you had a bad breakup. I've never had have I had a bad breakup? I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe. I have to think about that. I don't really know, actually. So there's just a crisis in your life, or you have just emotional issues, right? I don't think it's really, if you're someone who feels blue quite often, you're probably in good company among a lot of people who write. or if you have a lot of anxiety, I'm not shy about saying that I feel anxious about stuff a lot. Those things can get in the way of writing, and they get in the way of writing differently than writer's block. And I think you need to be aware of it. Writer's block is you can't start to write because you are afraid of not being perfect. And I've talked about writer's block, and I'm probably contradicting myself a little bit here, but there's one type of writer's block where you're afraid of not being perfect. This is the first type where you sit down in front of your computer and there's the blinking cursor, the little bar that blinks. Is it called a cursor? I have no stinking idea. And then there's the other kind where you sit down and there's just tons of stuff going on in your life. And you're like, wow, I can't even begin to write because I feel overwhelmed by everything else going on. I think that writing can be your best friend then. And I think that you have a lot to write about, actually. Here's the issue with dealing with stressors. That's what they're called, stressors. Stresses. Here's the issue. When you are trying to writing is a very ordered thing, right? And when you sit down to write and you're trying to write something not related to your stressors are getting in the way. This can be anything. Like if you're just really stressed out and stuff like someone dying in your family, stuff like a breakup, things like having really bad anxiety, things like having really bad depression can be huge stressors, and they likely are really huge stressors in your life. So they are disorder. They are disorder in your life. And I talked last week about chaos in your life, and I talked last week about how I think it's good when things are presented as being a little chaotic. But the human psyche, we'll call it psyche, whatever you want to call it, is fine. The human, because the human psyche is the human, right? Can only take so much stress at a time. And if you want to create order, like I said, writing is creating order. It's really, really difficult when you have all these stressors, when you have all this disorder going on, when you cannot control everything around you. This is what I suggest. This is actually something that will help you a lot. This is something that's helped me a lot in the past, where I'm worried about something a lot, or whatever it is, or I feel blue, or there's something going on in my life that isn't particularly good. I don't like it. There's something in my life I can't change. Is you take that, you sit down at your computer, and you start writing about that. The cool thing about this is actually writing has been shown, and I don't have the research. If I find the research, I'll put it up in the show notes. Writing has been shown to really help people with issues in their lives, especially, I think, mental health issues. So if you're someone who doesn't write and has mental health issues, consider writing. And this is why I think it does. I don't know if this is, I don't know, I don't have scientific research to back it up, but I think this is really true. I've said it like 16 times already. Writing is an act of ordering things. Now, when you have tons of stressors in your life, you are out of control. There's a lot of things out of your control. Now, if you have really bad depression, one thing people have a tendency to do is get into learned helplessness. And I've explained learned helplessness in the past. But what it is the classic example, man, of learned helplessness is you have a dog and you have it penned in this box, and you shock the dog. The floor, volts of electricity go through the floor, and since the dog can't get up out of the box, it eventually just lays down and just takes it, which is really, really sad if you think about it. They didn't shock the dog a lot, okay? They didn't kill the dog. It was unpleasant. The dog wanted to get out, but eventually the dog learned to sit in it. Now, what happens with depression? What happens with anxiety? Especially, I think this happens especially with emotional issues or worrying and stuff like that, because it's something that's so pervasive and something that is continually in a person's life. But what happens is a person experiences these things, and it feels like it's coming from somewhere outside the person, right? For really little kids, I think that there's a perception that things outside of them are oppressing them. They're pushing down on them. But once you become an adult, once you realize the issues are your own, you feel like your brain isn't your own brain. I think that's a valid description of what this is. And that means that you're not fully in control of your brain, which is really disconcerting, right? If you're not completely in control of your brain. not completely in control of what's going on in your life. And when you're not completely in control of what's going on in your life, you feel stressed out, you need to control certain things. I suggest sitting down and taking control of those things through writing. What you do is however you want to express those things. So I had a really difficult time in my life, and I started writing a lot of poetry about it. That probably will be published posthumously, I'm sure, because nobody ever is going to see it. But I started writing poetry about it, and the reason why I did is because I didn't understand it. I had this time in my life where I was really, really depressed, and it was the first time I'd experienced something like that. And when you don't understand what's going on in yourself, it's a lot harder to react and interact in the world. And what I did is I just wrote and wrote, trying to get to what this thing was exactly. I tried to describe it. I tried to describe the whole entire process of what the thing was, what depression was. And when I got done, it was more satisfying because I could look back on what's going on, and I could suddenly look outside myself to see, okay, I know what's going on. I know what the point is. I know that this is happening in me. And then you feel like you're in more control, because you are more in control when you understand something better. What writing does, and this still happens to me, like once in a while I'll be really worried about something, and then I'll sit down to write, and I'll be like, man, I don't know what to write about. And the reason why I don't know what to write about is because I am so worried about something, I'm distracted from the writing itself. I'm distracted from the content I want to get down on paper. But there's been a lot of times where I sit down to write, and I'm like, man, I'm really worried. And I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to write about this stuff. I'm not writing directly about what I'm worried about, but I'm writing about, I'm using that as a starting point to write from a character's perspective. And I may not keep that information. I may not keep what I'm writing. I may throw it out in the end, but at the same time, I'm getting it out. And that frees up my brain. I'm taking something that is disordered and I'm ordering on paper. There is an entropy in the world. I think that you have to acknowledge that there's an entropy. I mean, you certainly don't have to, but I think if you're being honest with yourself, like I said last week, there's entropy in our lives. Let me explain that really quickly if you don't remember completely what I was talking about last week. Things, when you hit 25 years old, your body starts rotting. And not rotting, but your body starts, your body is unable to replace the cells as fast as they are going away. Before 25, your body is able to. So at 25, you're on a downhill trend until you die. Okay? Besides that, if you have any family members, if you have parents, your parents are older than you. By the time you hit about 30 years old, your parents are on the cusp of old age, at the very least. If not on old age, if you have older siblings. Your grandparents, once you hit about 18, your grandparents don't have a lot of years left. Also, if you build a house and you leave that house and you don't maintain that house, it will slip into decay. Everything will fall apart in it. It will break. It's called entropy. It's the third law, Newton's third law. I don't remember if it's Newton's third law. Now, the cool thing about humans is that they fight against entropy. I think that's really, really cool. The same thing is true with mental issues. The same thing is true with stressors in your life. Now let's just say you get in a really bad breakup, and you can choose to do multiple things in that. Now, you're certainly going to do some self-destructive things in that breakup. Mainly, you're going to just be moping around and be like, oh, poor me. I had a friend, and I'm sure he wouldn't care if I told this because I'm not going to say who I'm talking about, but he liked a girl, and it ended up bad. Like, it didn't end up badly, but she rejected him, and he really, really liked her at that time. He doesn't like her anymore. He's married now, and I think he got fat because of it, which I think is awesome. He got fat because of it. He was just so unbelievably mopey. I really liked the guy, but he was unbelievably mopey. And he just sat, and he actually jokes about it now. He's like, he'll hear songs about the time he was about things he was listening to. Man, he hears songs from that time period, like the songs he was listening to. He's like, yeah, this was my jam back then. I really like that. And you listen to this song, and you're like, I am so unbelievably depressed right now because of this song. he was dwelling in that. And the self-destructive part isn't necessarily dwelling in it. It can be, depending on how long you dwell in it and if you're not willing to do anything about it. The self-destructive part is probably getting fat for him. It might be the length he dwelt in it. But dwelling in it, like there's a certain extent where you need to grieve over something. There's a certain extent where you need to acknowledge what is happening. And there's also a point where you need to be like, well, I'm done grieving over this and I'm going to move on with my life and I'm going to grow because of it. And I think that writing provides a perfect medium for doing this. So if you ever are at a point where you're like, man, my life really sucks, I would consider writing about it, even if you're writing a short story about it, because what you're doing is you're taking all that information you have about that bad part of your life, you're synthesizing it through yourself. And you're trying to put it into order, even if that order isn't necessarily the same thing. I think I talked about this. There's a book. Gosh, I can't remember her name. There's a writer. There is a professor. I wonder if she's still a professor. I think it'd be cool to have her on. I wonder if she would come on. But she teaches writing, and her book talks about how to write with ease, how to write creatively with ease. And what she does is she's like, well, first you start by clustering. So you write something in the middle, like an idea, and then you make, it's one of those spider charts where you just like write something in the middle, you write something else in a bubble next to it, and you just keep on expanding it until you have this big web of bubbles. And then she says, put that off to the side, and you've kind of got this cloud of ideas in your mind, and you write about it. And that's what the same exact thing you're doing when you're not necessarily writing about something directly, but you're coming at it from the side. C.S. Lewis, if you like C.S. Lewis, he actually did this. He was a Christian, and he believed that when you talked about spiritual things, you couldn't talk about them directly to actually understand them completely. Whether you agree with it or not, you'll understand my point. But he believed you had to come in from the side. And even if you're not, and in some cases, when you're not writing about that bad thing directly, it's better. In some cases, it's probably better to write about it directly. But I think that making something new out of it is so much more satisfying because you get the closure. You get to process that thing. You give order to the chaos. And you get to create something new because of it. You bring new life to things because of it. I'm of the opinion that a lot of really, really good art is created that way because people are able to take really bad things in their life and they're able to draw it through themselves. It's kind of like, so there's the process distillery. The process of distillery, if you've ever seen one of my favorite shows, if not my favorite show, is MASH. So if you like MASH, that's awesome. You might not be awesome, but it's awesome that you like it. I don't know you, so I can't really say whether you are. If you ever see that show, they have a still, and it goes through this process. How it works is I think how it works is you mash something up, like you mash potatoes up to create vodka, and then you have this pulp, and then you are boiling it, and then all the vapors go up, and then they condense, and then it comes down as liquor. Now, I believe you have to ferment it first before you do that, but it comes down as this really pure liquor. And I think a similar process goes through your mind when you are trying to write about things in your life that are really, really difficult. When everything is like collapsing in your life, and you sit down and do something creative, and you're trying to do something, you're not trying to just present who you are. You're not trying to present what you're going through. You're trying to present the essence of that thing. And I've talked about the essence of the thing before with my logic episode, which is like the second or third episode. The essence of a thing, if you haven't listened to that episode, is the core of it. What is that thing when everything else is taken away but that thing? So, for example, what makes a human? What can I take? What is not required to make a human? What is needed to be a human? Or, for example, it's like, what do I need to have a triangle? Well, it needs to have 3 sides, and the inner angles need to add up to 180 degrees. If it doesn't have that, it's not a triangle. In the same way, when you look at this, these things going on inside you, when you're looking at these experiences that you're going through, if you're trying to create something, I'm doing hand motions, by the way. If you're trying to create something from it, it helps me. It helps me to do hand motions. you need to find what that core is, or you need to at least play around until you find what that core is. And I don't know. I think it's something that has been really helpful to me in the past. I guess like I've been thinking about stuff a lot. I've been trying to understand what I'm going through. I'm in school right now, and I don't particularly like school, so it's a stressor for me. So I'm trying to figure out a way to order that and make sense of it. And I guess this is one of those ways. Anything creative for me is one of these ways. But it's something that's really been helpful. And the hardest time in my life, I don't think it's going to continually be the hardest time in my life. I certainly think there's another time. The hardest time in my life brought about some of the most interesting creative work because I didn't know what I was dealing with. I just struggled through what I was dealing with, through what I was writing. And I came up with something really unique. I came up with something that was representative of what I was going through, that explained what I was going through, but explained it in a way that was really creative. I don't know. I hope that that's useful. I think you can do that with anything, though. I don't think it's necessarily things that are difficult, right? I think that you can do it with anything. You try to get to the heart of that thing. If you want to express love, if you want to convey love in what you're writing, you don't have to convey love, every single aspect of love, because you can't convey every single aspect of love, but you can convey a particular and simple thing that conveys a specific type of love. One thing that really conveys love to me is when somebody does something for someone else that they dislike and the other person doesn't know about it. Like they are doing something and they, I think maybe it's a paternal instinct for me, but I don't have kids, but I think it's still a paternal instinct where you give something up for someone else. Like you have dreams or you have something that you really want to do, but you're willing to sacrifice those things so someone else is able to live, so someone else is able to have something better. And I think that is a very strong love. I think it's something really powerful. So yeah, so you don't have to just do it with hard things. I was just addressing it as difficulties. I was just addressing difficulties because I think that it's something that is really useful for people, and a lot of people have a lot of issues, and that's okay. Nobody's perfect, and I don't think anyone gets out of life unscathed. I don't think so. If you're like just this happy person and you've always been happy and there's nothing ever that shakes you, I mean, there's got to be something that is coming up the pike. Is that the term? Is that what you say? I really don't care. I'm just going to make up my own stuff. All right, we're going to jump into our logical fallacy of the week. And honestly, there's a lot of them left, but at the same time, I'm running out. So I'm probably going to cycle back through logical fallacies, people. And our logical fallacy of the week, I have no idea if I said this before, but our logical fallacy of the week is magical thinking. So if you are a religious person, well, first of all, you should know that I am a religious person. So I'm not trying to demean that viewpoint. I'm not trying to demean the idea that there is a divine being. Okay, the magical thinking fallacy is when you attribute that you create causal relationships between actions and events. So a very simple one to remember is because someone prayed, therefore something happens, right? Or you could say that because this also deals with superstitions. So just because I wore my socks that I haven't washed in 13 years, we won a basketball game, or my team won a football game, or because I cheered for my team when I was sitting at home in front of the TV, my team won. That doesn't really work that way, and nobody actually believes it works that way. People do believe that praying does something, right? People actually think that praying or a ritual or something like that will do something in the world. In the past, people thought that specific rituals or specific avoidance of taboos or engaging in taboos would do a specific thing. People generally are more jaded to those things. I actually think that I'm a Christian. I'm not shy about it at all. I don't think I'm shy about it, but I think that there's a case to be made that if there's a divine being, and that divine being is likely personal because that divine being created in some form or another personal beings that we see ourselves, therefore that divine being would be personal, right? Because can something impersonal create something personal? That's the question. And I don't think it can. I think that the personal is superior to the impersonal. Of course, you could argue that, oh, well, you are a personal being. You want to interact with other people. Therefore, you say that's the truth. But it's beings that are less personal are seem to be lesser than humans. They create less things. Even if you take a purely evolutionary biological perspective, things that are less evolved are less personal, right? And most of the time we say, well, it's a superior creature if it's more evolved, right? So even from that perspective, I would say that the more complex something is in this evolutionary perspective, the more personal it is. And humans are the most complex because you look at our brains and we have more neurons, I believe, than stars are in the known universe. I don't know. I shouldn't actually say whether I think that's correct. But yeah, so I would say that, okay, if there's a being that is a god, this god is probably intimately involved in everything that the god has created. I come from an author's perspective, and authors are very involved in what they create in a book. And this being that would be a divine being would be so much bigger and so much more unexplainable and not the humans would not be able to understand this being, that I believe that this being would have the capability of being intimately involved in every little tiny piece of what's going on. My belief is that God actually is maintaining everything, right? You might say, well, I don't really believe that. I think that God just set it in motion if you're a deist, but I actually think that God maintains everything. I think that there is entropy built into the system, as I said before, but at the same time, things wouldn't be held together if God was like, well, I'm not going to hold it together anymore. There's no reason for it to be held together unless God holds it together. So that's kind of how I feel about that. So I believe that since God is intimately involved in these things, that God actually does hear prayers and the world is affected by them. But at the same time, just because there is a prayer does not mean that the world is affected by that prayer. We can actually not really know. So that is all I've got for you this week. Do not fall into magical thinking or be realistic about when you are engaging in something similar. I think that people should be aware of these things just so they can be like, if somebody brings it up in an argument to be like, well, you think this is just happening because you prayed, you can be like, yeah, I know that this is classified like this, but this is the reason why I actually believe that it has an effect, which I think is legitimate. So, as always, my name is Daniel Poppy. My wife is calling me, so I have to go, and this is How to Write Good. Have a good night.